Folks, if I could ask you if we hope you don't leave, but if you are leaving, if you could step out of the aisles and let people take a seat.
So please take your seats, come in front, you're ready for the session.
Great. So this is going to, I don't know if it's going to be a debate, but it certainly will be provocative based on the conversations that I've already had here in Tbilisi with the two moderators. If I could ask you all please to just take a seat in the back, folks. Okay, thank you so much. Migration, I can think of no other topic in the news that is so central to the political convulsions that are happening around the world, and yet, at least in my view, covered by many media in such a profoundly reductive way, and so lacking in nuance. And we hope to change that in this conversation because it is a story that is ongoing and has a profound impact on the world and where it's going and on the way we see the past. And we've got two extraordinary panelists here who are expert and have very strongly held views on the topic. So this will be very interesting. Suketu Mehta, who many of you saw on the panel yesterday. I'm going to do the most briefest. Forgive me if I don't mean to do disservice to your extraordinary career. But I'm going to reduce. Speaking of reductive, I'm going to reduce your careers down to just a few lines. So Suketu is a journalism professor at NYU and the New York-based author of Maximum City, Bombay Lost and Found, which won pretty much every award that you can imagine. And his new book, This Land is Your Land, An Immigrant's Manifesto, which is going to be the topic I'm sure we'll be discussing momentarily. And you have a new book coming up in the works now as well, right? On immigrants in New York, for which he's been awarded a Guggenheim. Next to him is Laurence Lee. Is an Al Jazeera correspondent covering economics, social, and politics. You're now UK and Ireland, but have been around Europe as well, right? I should have asked you this ahead of time. He's a lifelong, you'll talk more about in a minute, very award-winning reporter who happened to have spent quite a bit of time here and in the former Soviet bloc covering the uprisings, both here in Georgia and elsewhere. So I'm going to jump right into it, and I've got some questions, and that will, I hope, for the two of you to talk about your point of view. I'm going to try to keep this as conversational as possible, and I will weave early audience participation because I know we have some provocations for you, and we want to hear your questions as well. So, Suketu, for both of you, apologies, but I'm going to read your own words back to you in each case because I find in different ways both your approaches just deeply profound. Suketu, your new book is basically, I will let you explain it better than I will, but the concept of immigration or migration as reparation. And I'm just going to read these couple of lines from a recent New York Times op-ed from a few weeks ago. Today, 250 million people are migrants. They are moving because the rich countries have stolen the future of the poor countries. Whether it is Iraqis and Syrians fleeing the effects of illegal American wars, or Africans seeking to work for their former European colonial masters, or Guatemalans and Hondurans trying to get into the country that peddles them guns and buys their drugs. They are coming here because we were there. And when I originally read it, and even reading it now, it gives me chills. You talk about how the imperialist nations have a responsibility to repair what they broke. So please talk to us a little bit more about that.
And thank you, and thank you all for coming. Yeah, this book was born out of rage. I'm just outraged at the staggering global hypocrisy around migration. It seems to me the whole debate around immigration today has almost no historical depth. You know, the book began because of a story that my grandfather once told me. So my grandfather was born in India and worked most of his life in colonial Kenya. And then he retired in England. And he was sitting in a park in London one day minding his own business. And then this elderly British man comes up to him and he says to my grandfather, "Why are you here? Why don't you go back to your country?" And my grandfather, who came from a business family, says, because we are the creditors. You came to my country, you stole all my gold and my diamonds, so we have come here to collect. We are here because you were there. And it seemed to me, when you look at why people are moving, whether it's people from the Middle East coming into Europe or Central Americans coming into the United States, people are moving not because they hate their homes or their language or their families. They make incredibly perilous journeys. And they move because they have no choice, because the rich countries have stolen the future of the poor countries through colonialism, through war, through inequality or corporate colonialism, and climate change. And so mass migration, I argue, is going to be the defining human phenomenon of the 21st century. And if you think 4 million Syrians wanting to get asylum in Germany are a problem now, what happens when Bangladesh gets flooded and 400 million Bangladeshis have to find dry land? So in terms of migration, you ain't seen nothing yet.
I should have said in the beginning, I think that the word rage will be a thread that runs through this, having again talked to both of them, and for good reason. The concept, though, of migration as reparation, conceptually, it's a very, very powerful idea. How realistic do you think it is that approach, that the nations that were there will adopt that approach in their attitudes about migration?
So in my New York Times article, I refer to migration as reparation. So the American writer Ta-Nehisi Coates has argued that the United States owes its black citizens today reparations for what African Americans have endured throughout America's history. Basically, the country was built on the backs of slave labor. So I want to take that argument and make it a global argument, that the rich countries owe it to the poor countries to let their people in. So mine is an angry book, but with a happy ending. And the happy ending is that when people move, everyone benefits. The rich countries, because the rich countries aren't making enough babies, and they need young immigrant labor to pay into their pension systems and to work, to take care of their old people. So when people migrate, it benefits the host countries, it benefits the migrants themselves because their income rises by an average of 5-fold, and it benefits the countries that they move from because remittances, the money that migrants send back in small increments, $100, $200, it's the best way of helping the global poor. It's 4 times all the foreign aid in the world combined. That's what people send back to their villages, to their families, in terms of remittances. So, so I argue in my book, that the question of what kinds of immigrants to let in should be based on how much a particular country has despoiled another country. So I argue, America now, Trump in general doesn't like immigrants of any kind. But he and his son-in-law, Kushner, they now have a plan to bring in skilled immigrants, to emphasize skilled immigrants over the people coming in from the southern border. So skilled immigrants means my kind of people, Indians and Chinese. And what I argue is that America owes more to Central Americans, to Salvadorans, Hondurans, Guatemalans, than it does to Indians. So I think, I don't know if Trump will certainly start following my advice, but the moral case has to be made that these countries owe a debt. And then, every great revolution has begun with a moral case being made.
Well, we'll come back to this topic, and also I think perhaps, if I may, the underlying theme of racism when it comes to a lot of the immigration policy. But I want to turn it over to Laurence for a couple of minutes, because you talk a lot about, you also have your own form of rage, which I'm sure we're about to hear about. And I'm particularly interested in your ideas about what you describe as the hypocrisy of the left. And I'm going to read a small passage from one of your articles. where you're talking about what's happening on the Turkish border, what was happening on the Turkish border. You say, so while Hungary, so obviously we're talking about the policies of Viktor Orban, which I'm sure everybody in the room is familiar with. So while Hungary continues to berate the EU for being too soft, in fact, the EU and its other member states are practicing exactly the same policies on the other borders. The EU casts itself as the world's leading liberal voice. Its member states are desperate, however, to keep the anti-Muslim and anti-immigration hard right out of power. As a consequence, they have joined the likes of Hungary in its battle with the refugees. So talk a little bit about this hypocrisy that you've crystallized so well on this passage.
Well, I've spent most of the last 5 years watching the movements of people from Africa and the Middle East into Europe on a variety of different routes. And I think the first thing to say is that language is really important. Yeah. And when the media, at least in my country, talks about it being a migrant crisis, it seems to me to be the biggest and most egregious lie that you can imagine. I mean, you know, I've met hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these people, and they're not migrants, you know, because migrants implies choice. They're refugees, you know. I met one guy who was a Moroccan trying to say he was an Iraqi, who gave himself away because he started speaking French to me. But apart from that, they're refugees. And you know, crisis, well, it's certainly a crisis for them, you know, because they used to have houses and cars and schools and bicycles and back gardens and stuff. And now here they are dispossessed and sleeping on the side of a motorway and shitting in a field, you know. So it's very definitely a crisis for them. And they're in a hostile environment, Europe, yeah? So, but when the media talks about a crisis, they don't mean a crisis for them. They mean a crisis for any given European country of, say, 10 or 15 million people that seems to regard it as an existential threat to itself, to try to accommodate and resettle perhaps 10 or 15,000 people under the quota system. You know, I mean, it should have been really simple for the European Union to absorb that many people without even noticing as the world's leading liberal voice. So, you know, what it was and what it remains is not a migrant crisis, but a refugee resettlement crisis and a crisis of the rule of law in the European Union, and have now got themselves in the most bizarre situation where there are any number of European countries that maintain a standing army in Afghanistan because it's so unstable. And yet the European Union has said that Afghanistan is a safe place and is rejecting Afghans' asylum claims out of hand. But every single time they deport a plane load of Afghans and dump them at Kabul airport, they're breaking the law. It's really serious.
But you are suggesting, part of what you're suggesting, I think, is that in an effort for again, the leading liberal voice is, you know, as you call it, the EU.
That's what it calls itself.
Yeah, well, yes. To forestall the greater ascension of the far right, that they're putting stringent policies in place so as not to inflame the populations.
The thing about, you know, I mean, you've ended up in a situation where Viktor Orban, you know, says that the only way to defend Christian Europe is to keep them all out, you know, and apparently he's winning the argument. But at least with him, you know where you are, because he just tells it like he thinks, you know. The grossest hypocrisy, you know, you talked about the Turkey border with Greece, great big wide river. The people traffickers are sending them over from Turkey into Greece in dinghies, and the Greek police are shooting the dinghies to try and sink them in the river. Over in France, I've met Afghan kids who are sleeping in the forest south of Calais, and you ask the villagers, oh yeah, they're over there. None of them are lifting a finger to help these people, and meanwhile the police are tear gassing the rest of the refugees in Calais to disperse the camp without a first clue about what they're going to do with them. And yet these same countries are saying that hunger is the problem. They're exactly the same as each other. There's absolutely no difference, is there?
You know, one of the things, it's interesting, you talk about how language is so important, and Suketu, that's something that you talk about as well. I love your line that's etymology is destiny, and when you talk about, you know, the difference between, like you said, migrants, or do we use the word migrant or do we use the word refugee? do we use the word cage or do we use the word cell? In recent weeks, there's been raging debate about the appropriateness of the term concentration camp when it comes to the kids on the kids and the families on the border between the U.S. and Mexico. Sorry? Yeah. And so you have talk a little bit about that as well.
Absolutely. What you answer to when you're asked at the border, what are you? An economic migrant, a refugee, a migrant, a traveler. I lived in Abu Dhabi for 4 months, and I was interested to see that the South Asians in the Emirates are called migrants, but most of the white people get to be called expats. Right? So I'd much rather be an expat than a migrant. And they couldn't figure out quite what I was, because I have an American passport, but I'm still South Asian, so I could be one or the other, depending on... expats lead a much more glamorous life than migrants. There's now if you listen to Fox News in the United States, there'll be people saying, these people aren't legitimate refugees, they're really just economic migrants. They're coming to the US to make a better life. Well, yeah, just like your parents did, or your forefathers, whoever, whatever part of the world that you came from, you came to the United States to make a better life for yourself and your children. That's why, the whole terminology around migrants in Europe and the US is freighted with not just scorn, but actual hatred. And I'm reminded of Nazi descriptions of the Jews as vermin. So Donald Trump, the most powerful man in the world, actually refers to migrants coming in from Mexico as, quote, vomit. I mean, these are human beings, and he refers to them as puke.
Animals.
Animals, yeah. And he makes a distinction between the Nordic countries and shitholes. So when he talks about Africa or Haiti, he calls these countries shitholes. So, when people think of immigrants, Trump and his minions, they think of, these are the terms that they use. Same with Orban in Hungary. He says, basically, every migrant is a potential terrorist. My term for these migrants is different. I call them ordinary heroes. And I've met numberless of these ordinary heroes, as I'm sure you have too in your reporting. And I'm reminded of, and I have examples of this in my book. Basically, people are migrating to save their own lives or to make a better life for their children. And when you speak to these nannies and these laborers who braving incredible odds to cross these borders, you just see it really is this kind of heroism. And so we should all aspire to the values of these migrants, because if we're talking about family values, there's a part of my book which talks about the US-Mexico border in Tijuana and San Diego. There's a place called Friendship Park where there's a fence where if your family is on the other side and you don't have the papers to go to Mexico, then you can come to this small bit of fence and you can put your hands up against the fence, and your mother might come from the other side, and you're not allowed to hug, but you can talk to her for 10 minutes at a time on weekends, and the holes in the fence are large enough to put your pinky finger through, and mom puts her pinky finger through, and it's called the pinky kiss. So I spent 2 weeks at this place, Friendship Park, and I saw family after family come to this fence and reunite. People who hadn't seen their parents, their wives, their children, their siblings, in some cases for decades. This was the only place where they were allowed to talk to each other face to face, but not touch, except for this kissing of pinkies. I mean, it renewed my faith in the family.
Did you want to add something? We talk about, at least in the United States, and sorry, my rage meter is starting to go up over the course of this session as well. a lot of the coverage in the United States when they talk about, hard, strongly held opinions, anti-immigration opinions among many Americans, particularly supporters of Trump. God, it's a time warp, sorry. What I wouldn't give for Bush to be president right now instead of Trump. A lot of it is painted as economic insecurity. And yes, but I can't help thinking, it always strikes me as economic insecurity not really a gentler way to talk about deep-seated racism. Fear and loathing of somebody that doesn't look like me, particularly as a white person. How much of that do you think is neither of you have really talked about racism. You've couched it in other terms.
It seems to me that certainly inside Europe, the biggest failure over the last 5 years has been from the European left, yeah, because they have adopted the language of the right wing, yeah. So in my country, you have people like the former Foreign Secretary, a guy called David Miliband, who now is the president of the International Rescue Committee, so you'd think he knows what he's talking about burden sharing, yeah? Refugees are a burden, as opposed to an opportunity, yeah? Gordon Brown, former Labour Prime Minister, British jobs for British workers, yeah? The current Labour Party, which supports Brexit, on the basis that it apparently thinks that, the white working class in England are suspicious of immigrants. And, they call themselves a bunch of internationalists, yet seem to think that British workers are more important than their, European counterparts. The hypocrisy is enormous. And the trouble is, if you accept that, there's only so many jobs to go around and the pie is only so big, and these people are going to be a threat or a burden on some level, you're always going to lose the argument to the right wing, because they will say it more plainly than you, and they will call you out all the time for double standards, yeah? And the problem, I think, it boils down to this, as it is at the moment, because as you say, it's going to get worse. There needs to be a completely different argument made and a totally different form of language to say why these people are not a problem and it's actually a good thing that's happening. And I just think people need to start going full bore, basically, and just shutting down the argument that says, on some level, this is quite difficult to manage, yeah? Stop it before it starts and just completely reset the agenda. Because I think if you don't do that, you're going to lose. And certainly the argument is being lost at the moment, because all over the world these people are sprouting up as heads of state, aren't they?
I agree that race is an enormous factor in this fear of migrants. And so there's a chapter in my book which talks about the origins of this kind of race hatred. And a lot of it comes, unsurprisingly, from France. There was a 1973 novel called Camp of the Saints by a man named Jean Raspail. It's one of the most racist books ever written. And it imagines a convoy of people from my birthplace, Calcutta, coming into France. And the people on this convoy, they're having sex with each other's children, they're eating each other's feces, the most repulsive descriptions of Indians. And so this convoy is coming to France, and there's, they aren't armed, but they're just going to come ashore, and that's the fear itself, that this brown horde is going to come to France. And the novel imagines this French fifth columnists, these liberal French people who are going to welcome these migrants with open arms, and they're also painted as patsies and cucks. And so this novel became enormously influential. Marine Le Pen keeps it by her bedside. Steve Bannon often refers to it as one of his favorite books. And the novel was reprinted in America by a malevolent Michigan ophthalmologist named John Tanton, who's the father of the modern American anti-immigration movement. He founded FAIR and Numbers USA and the Center for Immigration Studies, which have an enormous influence in current American immigration policy. And he republished this book. There's also the French theory of the Grand Replacement, the Great Replacement, So the white supremacists marching in Charlottesville were carrying these banners, "We will not be replaced." So sometimes when I get racist hate mail from these white supremacists, there's this tagline at the end saying, "We will not be replaced," or "You will not replace us." And my answer is, but we have already replaced you. We're richer than you, we're smarter than you, and next we're coming for your women and your men as well. So the great fear in the US is the number 2044. So that is the year where America is slated to become a majority-minority nation. And even if Trump achieves all his dreams of throwing out all 12 million undocumented, that date will only get pushed back at most 5 years. It's going to happen. The United States is going to be a majority-minority nation. So whites will be just one of many minorities. But then, by that time, the whole definition of white is, it's kind of meaningless. Is Obama half white or half black? 1 out of 4 Americans today marries someone not of their own race. There's this wonderful choosing, this wonderful miscegenation happening all over the world. People are choosing to marry, their own race, another race, their own gender, another gender. They're choosing to shift their own gender completely or be gender neutral. And it's wonderful. All over the world, the giant choosing. And this is deeply threatening to people who think that, America is a white Judeo-Christian nation. So that's the origin of that race fear.
Not even sure about the Judeo, considering that in Charlottesville they were chanting, "Jews will not replace us." Right. So it's not just etymology is destiny, demography is destiny.
Demography is, exactly.
At least. So I want to just shift a little bit to, you talk about on the one hand you're saying that migration crisis is going to get worse, but you also talk about how your book ends, it has a happy ending, I suppose, or at least the happy benefit. And you talk about, and both of you have talked about the imperative, how that the economic benefits of migration, the birth rate replacement, et cetera, but yet how I guess, and please help me feel more optimistic about this, because I'm not feeling terribly optimistic. And maybe it comes back to your issue, Laurence, which was we haven't found the right language to talk about it. But how is that message, how can that message of, if you just let the migrants in, if you just bring in the refugees, history has proven that there is economic benefit, that the country that is receiving the immigrants gets economically stronger, that all economies get stronger. How can that message possibly penetrate in the face of such resistance?
I mean, I've tried so many different arguments. Think about the gene pool, yeah? Think how good the England side's going to be in 10 years' time, yeah? Think about all the new restaurants, there's a guy called, a very good Turkish footballer called Mesut Özil, who was a Turkish guy playing for Germany, and he recently announced that he wasn't going to play for Germany anymore because, as he said, when I play well, I'm a national hero, and when I play badly, I'm a Turkish immigrant. And I always say, never underestimate the moral flexibility of white people. Yeah. And actually, I don't know what the argument is, because you can bombard people with facts and statistical proof, and you still don't get anywhere.
All right, Suketu, cheer us up.
Yeah. So look, we're here at the Storytelling Festival, and it seems to me that is a global contest of storytelling. There are all these populists, right? Putin, Trump, Erdogan, Orban, Modi, and they excel at telling a false story well. So the only way to defeat them is to tell the true story better. And the true story of migration is a good news story. And look, there's always going to be a subset of the population. In the United States, it's about a third of the population that just aren't ready to buy the true story. They've been brainwashed by Fox News, they're angry, they hate people like me, people with my color. Am I going to convince them? No. But the way we assert ourselves is through political power, and that's the happy ending of my book. So in that annus horribilis 2016, when Trump got elected, I got a call from my brother-in-law in the South, not a progressive part of the country. And he said he was going to run for state senate, and he's Indian. And I said, "You're going to run for state senate? How are you going to support my sister?" And he said, no, I think I've got a shot. I'm going to campaign. So because his family, I went down, and my two sons, we went down and we campaigned for him. He was running in a district that was 70% white. His name is Jay Chowdhury. Most of his constituents, or his potential constituents, couldn't pronounce his last name. He's Indian. And he was running against a white man with the fine old southern name of Ellis Hankins, the chairman of the League of North Carolina Municipalities. So we didn't think he had much of a shot, but since his family, we went around campaigning for him. And it was tough. This was the South. My son had a gun pulled on him. I had a dog set on me, although it was a small dog, a poodle named Chewy. Chewy, you get back here. Poodles are vicious too. But he knocked on 10,000 doors, and he spoke to people in this constituency about what was important, which was schools. The Republicans had decimated the schools in Raleigh, and he said, I'm here to make your schools better, to restore public funding for the schools. And guess what? He won in a landslide. He's now the first Indian American state senator in North Carolina history, and he just became the Democratic whip in the state Senate. And he did this in his first run because all politics is local, all politics is personal, and that country still has that possibility that you can go and you can, the reason I still love America in spite of everything is it's a country made up of all the other countries. And I saw this firsthand with my brother-in-law, and that's the happy ending of my book.
That's an amazing, very inspiring story. We're going to go to questions from you in just a moment, and also we're going to solicit your ideas on language that might penetrate this sort of very reductive view of migration. But I'm going to ask while we get people ready with microphones, is there any place that you can think of? Is there any country that you can point to that you feel has the most small p progressive views on immigration?
Canada. Canada realizes that you need warm bodies for cold countries. So it's actually increasing its immigration intake threefold. And yes, they do have a point system, and they do favor skilled immigration. But all the political parties in Congress, even under Stephen Harper's government, which is a very right-wing government, immigration was something that everyone could agree on. And when you go to a city like Toronto, you realize that multiculturalism works. That it's a city that's majority foreign-born, and it's thriving. It's thriving economically. There's very little racial tension. The same thing is true of places like New York. But Canada is really, and it's also got an interesting system of resettlement. So it's got these provincial visas. So if you want to come to Canada, if you agree to live in frozen Saskatchewan for a few years, then you get a residence permit to live anywhere in Canada. So as a result, I think there's something like 50,000 shivering Pakistanis in Saskatchewan. But they realize that Saskatchewan needs people, and there's a lot of people around the world who are ready to move. So again, it's what you said about seeing migration as an opportunity, not as a curse.
Yes.
And the Germans, I would say, they've now come out the other side of having taken so many more people in Europe than anybody else. There's some economic data coming out suggesting that all the refugees they took in are now benefiting the economy and growing the economy as a result. So, that's working. And the interesting thing in Germany is how political attitudes have changed. The AfD, alternative, the right wingers, who were doing quite well a little while ago, they're now stuck on 10%. And the party that's in the lead in all the polls at the moment in Germany is the Greens. They're beating the SPD at the moment on about 23, 24%. And so it seems to me to represent some proof that Germany as a country has got its head around the fact that having brought all these people in hasn't destroyed anything, but has actually made things better.
Thank you. Okay, what do we have any questions from the audience. We have just all the way in the back. I don't know where the mics are, but, and if you could just, before you ask your question, just identify yourself.
I'm Agaki Makasaria. I'm one of the helpers here. I'm one of the assistants here. And I have a question. So, in 2008, when Russians invaded Georgia, I was on Dutch. I was to my.
Can you hold your mic
I was
a little
in the
closer?
countryside. I was in the countryside next to the war, and I was in the countryside next to the war that was going on, and my parents, my aunt, who was with me, told me that we might have to run, leave the country, and go to our cousins, either in France or either in England. A lot of my older cousins and family members left Georgia in the 90s to find a better life, as you were talking about. And I had a very deep dread. I felt very deep dread because it's not comfortable here. It's not nice here, especially for a nerdy kid like me. They really don't like nerdy stuff here. So, but it was still my home, and I was really afraid of leaving it. Even if soldiers would come in tomorrow, yesterday, soon soldiers might come and take us away, or we have to run. But I still had this fear that I really didn't want it to go. And what do you, so my question is, for those migrants that come to England or Germany or those nice countries, as we call them, are you trying to create an environment that they can feel comfortable and successful there? Or are you trying to create an environment that they can return and make their countries comfortable, not their living rooms and apartments?
I think it's a very interesting question. And certainly the UK decided it was going to take in 25,000 people. And what it did primarily was to stick them all in the northeast of England in a post-industrial town where they were entirely isolated and with no chance of doing anything. And to make it even worse, they painted all the doors of the houses where they were going to put these people red. So all the local racists knew exactly where they were living. It was just a target practice, you know. So that model doesn't work. But there is, and I know this from personal experience, that there's a different scheme that the government has in the UK called refugee sponsorship. And how that works is any local community has to prove that it can provide at least £25,000, get a house, yeah, healthcare, schooling for the kids. I mean, everything you can think of. All that needs to be organised, and then the Home Office basically gives that community a family, yeah. And I'm part of a group in South London that's done this, and it is just the most joyous, life-affirming experience to actually see this extended family of Syrians living in Dulwich, you know. And I think as a model, even if you actually do this one family at a time, it's much better because that family automatically has, you know, a load of cotton wool around it and a group of people that they can look to that they know is going to support them. But it is painfully slow, and that's just to get one family organised like that, you know.
Also, your question is interesting because, you know, you potentially could be a refugee. And when people in the world think of refugees, they tend to think of brown and black people, right? But there's this new realization that any one of us in this room could be a refugee. It's really startling, and that partly explains the West's fear of refugees. When they see all these Syrians and Iraqis and Guatemalans and Hondurans coming in, part of it is this fear of chaos, that these people who are coming remind them that their own situation could also change suddenly, all at once, and irrevocably. So when we respect the refugee covenants that we've signed, which America manifestly is not doing at this moment, there might come a time when Americans might need to go to other countries for refuge. Today, there's 9 million non-military Americans living outside the country, particularly young people. And some of them, I would submit, are actually economic migrants because they're going to Europe for their health care. I met young Americans who are living in Europe saying, I can't make a living in New York or LA, but here, if I get sick, the government takes care of my health care, and education is paid for. They find it difficult to make a living in America. So I think when we look at migration, we should realize that it's not static. Any of us might need to move in the future.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'll just say that I have a slightly different view of Americans' attitudes towards immigration, which is I think that part of the problem is for many Americans, it's never occurred to them that they could be a refugee. And therefore, they're lacking in empathy. That it couldn't possibly happen in this country. It couldn't possibly happen to a white person. And if they thought that, then they might show a little more empathy. But that's based on no data. There's a question right over here.
I have a microphone.
Okay, we'll take this question and then you're next.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the very thought-provoking and
Can you hold your mic? Sorry, a little
very,
closer.
very interesting discussion. I have one question, and of course, this question is from my local context. I'm from Georgia, and my question obviously comes from Georgian context. But I wanted to say something and ask then. You mentioned that the migration is beneficial for everyone, for the recipient country, for those who leave, and also for the countries they leave from. And so the question is about the part where countries they leave from. And this being said, from my Georgian perspective, is that really good that so many skilled people leave? This is a small country, and we actually leave skilled people here to stay. And then in situations when you have countries who accept actually the skilled labor, what you get is, to me, might look like a new type of resource extortion again, But while those who are in economic need or who are not that skilled, they can't leave so easily, and they are remaining here and stuck in the poverty or in all these situations they are, trying to escape from. So is that true? I don't know. I mean, maybe this context is different from India, from China. I don't know. But from small countries like ours, extorting these skilled labor, educated people is very damaging. So what do you think about this? Thanks a lot.
Right. So you're talking about the brain drain, which economists have extensively debated. And it is true that when a state spends a lot of money to educate, let's say, a scientist or a doctor, and that person then gets the degree and moves to another part of the world, does the state lose? Well, it does to some extent. Now, I don't know about the Georgian experience, so I can't speak to that, but I can with the Indian experience. So there was this whole brain drain theory that there are all these Indians going all over the world and working as doctors and computer programmers, but who are educated in India. Well, it turns out that when they go abroad and they work for, let's say, Microsoft or Google or whatever, a subset of them come back to India and start new computer companies. They also send back money to their families. So, remittances in the case of countries like Pakistan and Philippines and Sri Lanka are the single biggest foreign exchange earner from skilled and unskilled labor. And there's also, the brain drain goes both ways. So many of these people who go abroad, then they come back for either a short while or a long time. And the ties to the old world today, in the age of cheap jet travel, are much closer than, let's say, the early 20th century, where the Italian or the Irish person, coming on a boat to America might go back to visit his homeland maybe once or twice in his life. Today, what is exile when a round trip home is $500, right? So it's more cyclical than one way, this movement of labor. And if you look at India, one of the strongest sectors of the economy is outsourcing. So Indians doing back office work for American or European banks. And many of those outsourcing firms have been started by Indians who moved to the United States and then moved back.
I would also just add that it seems to me that some of the most reactionary political leaders are in charge of countries whose people have benefited the most from migration. Take Hungary as an example. There are more Hungarians living in London than in any other Hungarian city other than Budapest. But if you're Viktor Orban, and someone says to you, why are you letting all these people leave? All your most talented people are leaving the country. He's not interested in things like economics. That's the thing about these right-wing populists. It's gut stuff. That's what they specialize in, not economics at all.
Okay, we have time just for one more question.
Okay.
We've got the mic here. Sorry, unless I'm told we can have more time.
Thank you for the talk. It was great. And so as the guy said over there, and like the whole idea of migration is basically based on that there's like nice countries and like countries that most people kind of want to go. And for example, the US has even like a lottery. You can win the green card to live in the country, so it's considered to be some like a prize. Like nobody kind of wants to win the prize to live, I don't know, in some not nice country. And so it's based on the closed borders. You can't just go to the country. For example, if you want to immigrate from, I don't know, Bangladesh to United States, you can just go there and like, okay, I'm gonna live here now. So my question is not even a question, like I would like to hear from you what if, like kind of like a fantasy, like your imagination, what's gonna happen if all the countries suddenly gonna cancel the borders? What the movement we're gonna have in the world with no borders? Everybody will go to the US, everybody will go to Europe, or like get disappointed and come back, like what's gonna happen? Like just some imagination. Thank you.
Sure, open borders. That
like no borders.
That bogey of the Republicans, open borders. My God, everyone's gonna just come into this room and there'll be no burgers left at McDonald's. So this is, in my book, I don't call for open borders. I call for open hearts, which is understand, have an empathy with the people who are needing to move. So there's this theory against open borders, and there's serious arguments against this, that, for example, the United States is like a lifeboat on an open sea. And if too many people get into the lifeboat, then, the whole boat sinks, and everyone sinks, the newcomers as well as the people who were on the lifeboat to begin with. Well, migration is like the weather. People will move from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure. But when they do, so one theory is that, and there are many economists are totally in favor of open borders. They think that after an initial period of adjustment, wealth and human happiness will be spread more equitably around nations. And so more people will stay home because the people who've gone ahead send back money in terms of remittances. Also, the world has always had open borders since around the beginning of the 20th century, when the whole convoluted superstructure of passports and visas, that's really only with us for around 100 years. People have always moved. During the age of mass migration, from the 1850s to around 1914, 1/4 of Europe got up from Europe and moved to America. And what happened? The United States replaced Europe at the pinnacle of world wealth and power. So, if the 21st century looks like things aren't going well for America, maybe it could open up its borders and Bangladeshis could make America great again.
And the only thing I'd add is one of the greatest lies around migration is the much trumpeted claim that migration causes unemployment. It doesn't. What actually happens is, if you look at the graphs, when a given country, say a destination country like the UK or somewhere, when its economy is growing, then you tend to get more people coming to that country for work. But when the economy then slows down, because that's how capitalism works, those people, the migration flows slow down, and they move to somewhere else where the economy is doing better. I think the answer to your question is it would actually just sort itself out. That's what I believe, anyway.
We actually have one more question. We got dispensation.
Thank you so much having this discussion coming like here, and the question is like connected to the past, like the resonance. What is having like when there was slavery in U.S. or colonialism in France, or like this bunch of people migrated from one place to another, and they didn't had any luxury to buy houses or had like education, and like bunch of like this generation through the kind of generation, they were living poor or paying for the rents and like buying like some like shitty food or something. Yeah, of course, it was like good and like beneficial for the global economics or like for the country, but there is kind of this huge generations of damaged, mentally ill people who didn't have the comfort to live normal lives. But at the same time, white like Americans had like the luxury to have the beautiful houses, not to pay the rent, and have education, and how it reflects, I don't know, like nowadays situation and how it will like go future. Who will take the responsibility to fix the kind of situation?
Right. So I, talk about this at length in my book, Colonialism and What's Replaced It. And the numbers tell the story, and the numbers are startling. During the colonial period, the European share of world GDP went from 20% to 60%. In my birthplace, when the British first came to India at the beginning of the 18th century, India's share of world GDP was 23%. By the time the British left in 1947, India's share of world GDP was under 4%. So, these countries were really built on colonialism and slavery, and it didn't end when the crown left these countries, because they left their corporations, their multinationals behind. And if you want to look at how the rich countries continue impoverishing the poor countries, you have to look at tax havens. So you look at the flows of money around the world. 40% of the profits of multinationals around the world are immediately moved to tax havens. The UK and its territories contain 1.4 trillion pounds of tax evading money. So there's a second British Empire around the world, and it's located in places like the City of London and the Cayman Islands. Colonialism didn't end with these countries leaving these territories. It morphed into corporate colonialism.
All right, well, we're going to have to, we're out of time, so thank you. Thank you so much to both our panelists. Thank you for your interests. Thanks.